The memo arrived in the middle of a drought. Warden Analyst Seba Vaughn received it the way she received everything that came through the Continuance Bureau's internal channel, on a cracked tablet propped against a half-empty water flask, read standing up, because sitting down for memos implied they deserved ceremony they hadn't earned yet. She was 41 years old, had been with the Bureau for 19 of those years, and had developed the professional habit of reading bad news the way surgeons remove splinters. Direct pressure, minimal fuss, over quickly. The memo was not bad news exactly. It was something the Bureau had no clean category for, which was, in Seba's experience, considerably worse. Subject: confirmed non-human signal. Arecibo class reception. Origin: unresolved. Recommendation: convene Tier 1 working group immediately. She read it twice, set the tablet down, picked up her water flask, discovered it was empty, set it back down, looked out the window of her second-floor office at the cracked earth of the Kalahari Basin monitoring station, which had once been a floodplain and was now a catalog of everything that happened when a system lost its water and nobody acted in time. Then she picked the tablet up again and read the memo a third time, because 3 times was how she determined whether something was real or whether her brain had manufactured urgency from exhaustion. The memo read the same all 3 times. She marked it received, typed 4 words into the response field, assembling working group now, and walked downstairs to wake Deshi. Deshi Aroa was 34, slept like a man with an untroubled conscience, and was the only xenolinguistic specialist within 400 kilometers of the monitoring station. He had come to the Kalahari Basin posting because, as he explained it during his intake review, if first contact ever happened, it would probably happen somewhere nobody was looking. He had been waiting 8 years. He did not look disappointed that it had taken this long. He looked, when Seba shook him awake and held the tablet in front of his face, like a man who had been conserving energy for exactly this. "How long ago?" he said. "Signal logged 14 hours back. Relay delay from the southern array. 14 hours. He sat up, rubbed his face. Why did it take 14 hours? Because the receiving technician thought it was atmospheric interference, logged it as probable equipment artifact, finished her shift and went home. Seba kept her voice even. "She's been called back." Deshi looked at the waveform data attached to the memo. His eyes moved the way eyes move when they are doing rapid, serious calculation rather than simply reading. "This isn't interference," he said. "No. This is structured." "Yes." He looked up. He had the kind of face that held its expressions briefly before resetting to neutral, a useful quality in a man whose job was to remain objective about extraordinary things. The expression it held right now, for approximately 3 seconds before the reset, was something Seba had no clinical name for. Not excitement, not fear. Something that existed in the narrow territory between the two, where the body has registered the size of an event before the mind has finished deciding how to feel about it. 14 hours, he said again, quieter. "I know." He got up. They went to work. The working group convened by remote connection at 0400 hours Johannesburg time, which meant it convened across 9 time zones, for continents, and 1 research vessel currently stationed in the Barents Sea, whose communications lead spent the first 7 minutes of the session visibly fighting seasickness with the specific dignity of a person who refused to be defeated by their body during a historic moment. Seba chaired. She had not been asked to chair. Nobody had been asked. She simply opened the session and nobody argued, because the fastest way to establish authority in a room full of scientists is to be the one who already knows what the data says. She walked them through it. 14 minutes of structured, non-repeating signal received on a frequency no human equipment used for transmission. Internal mathematical ratios consistent with intentional encoding rather than natural phenomena. No identifiable origin point. The signal appeared to originate from approximately 0.3 astronomical units above the ecliptic plane of the solar system, which was a coordinate that made 3 people on the call go very quiet in 3 different ways. "That's inside the heliosphere," said the astrophysicist from Oslo. A woman named Priya, and whose reputation for calm under pressure was apparently well-earned, because her voice did not waver even slightly when she said it. "Whatever sent this, it sent it from inside our solar system." Nobody responded for 4 full seconds, which was a long time for a group of people who talked for a living. "Could be a relay," said the signals engineer from Chennai. "Something positioned close. transmitting from a source further out. We can't rule that out, Deshi said. But we also can't assume it. Seba looked at the waveform on her screen. Structured, non-repeating, deliberately encoded. Something had sent this. Something had chosen this frequency, this location, this moment, 14 hours ago, while a technician was finishing her shift and thinking about going home. We respond or we don't, Seba said. Those are the two options. Everything else is a sub-choice inside one of those. The seasick communications lead from the Barents Sea, who had not spoken yet, said, "What happens if we don't?" Seba considered this. Outside, the Kalahari Basin cracked silently in the dark. She thought about the floodplain it had been, the water that used to move through it, confident of its path, until the path changed and the water had nowhere left to go. She thought about what it meant to receive something and choose silence. Whether silence in this context was neutrality or whether it was already its own kind of answer. Then we've already responded, she said. We just don't know it yet. She let that sit. Then, we have 72 hours before this goes to Tier 2 escalation and we lose control of the decision. I want a full decoding analysis from Deshi's team by 0800. I want origin triangulation attempt by noon. And I want everyone on this call to understand. She paused, not for effect, but because the next sentence needed to be exact. That whatever we decide together. Not a government. Not a military command. This group. Clear? The nods came in from 9 different time zones. Outside the window, the sun had not yet risen over the cracked earth. Somewhere above it, something waited. Deshi worked the way rivers work. Not in straight lines but finding the path of least resistance through the material, doubling back when blocked, trying another angle, patient in a way that looked from the outside like stillness but was actually constant motion just below the surface. Seba had watched him decode 3 previously unclassified signal artifacts in the 8 months since he'd arrived at the station. Each time, he had sat very still, made almost no notes, and then produced a complete structural analysis as though he had been assembling it somewhere internal, out of sight, until it was finished enough to show. He did not look like a man doing that now. Now he looked like a man standing in front of a door that kept rearranging its hinges. Tell me, Seba said. She had brought him coffee. He hadn't touched it. It's not a language, he said. Not in the way I'd usually approach this. It's not trying to communicate propositions. It's not structured like a message. He turned from the display. It's structured like a question. Seba looked at the waveform data. To her eye it remained what it had been since 0400. A series of elegant, non-repeating mathematical intervals that she could appreciate the architecture of without understanding the interior. One question or many? One, he said, repeated in 17 different formal registers. Like, he searched for the right frame. Like asking the same thing in 17 different tones of voice. Formally, casually, urgently, gently, as a demand, as an invitation. All the same question underneath. What's the question? Deshi was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, processing, finding the translation that was honest rather than comfortable. Are you finished yet? The coffee cooled between them. Seba sat with that for longer than she usually sat with things. She had a discipline around reaction time, a pause she inserted between receiving information and responding to it, trained into her over 19 years of writing reports about systems in collapse, where the worst decisions were always the fastest ones. The pause never felt long enough. It never resolved the uncertainty. It just ensured that what she said next came from the considered part of her rather than the frightened part. Finished with what? She said. That's the part it doesn't say. Deshi finally picked up the coffee, held it without drinking. 17 registers, all of them asking the same thing, none of them specifying the object. Are you finished? And then the signal ends. Whatever we're supposed to be finished with, it assumes we know. Priyafan's triangulation report arrived at 11:47, 13 minutes before deadline, because Priyafan was the kind of scientist who treated deadlines as a contractual minimum rather than an aspiration. The report was 4 pages long, dense with coordinate mathematics. Seba could follow an outline if not in full, and it concluded with a finding that Priya had flagged in red, not standard practice for her, which told Seba the flag was genuine rather than rhetorical. The signal origin was not fixed. It was moving, slowly, at a speed that would be unremarkable for a comet or a large asteroid on a standard heliocentric orbit, but moving with a consistency that ruled out natural drift. Something was traveling. Something had been traveling for long enough that Priya's back calculation placed its entry into the outer solar system at approximately 40 years ago. Seba read that number twice. Looked up at the window. The sun was high now over the basin. 40 years ago she had been 1 year old. Deshi hadn't been born yet. The monitoring station hadn't been built. The Continuance Bureau hadn't existed. The floodplain outside had still been a floodplain. Whatever was out there had arrived while the water was still moving. She called the working group back at 1,300 hours. 12 faces on the remote display, 9 time zones, one still pale communications lead from the Barents Sea who looked considerably more composed than he had at 0400 and considerably less composed than a man who'd had a full night's sleep. She presented Priya's findings without editorial. Let the numbers speak first, which was always the right order. When she finished, the silence had a different texture than the morning's silence. Denser. More crowded with things people weren't saying yet. The signals engineer from Chennai spoke first. 40 years. It's been in our solar system for 40 years and we're detecting it now because it transmitted. Correct, Seba said. It could have transmitted at any point in those 40 years. Also correct. So why now? Seba looked at Deshi. He was watching his hands, which meant he was thinking something he wasn't ready to say out loud. She gave him 3 seconds, which was how she allocated thinking time to people she trusted. The question, he said without looking up. Are you finished yet? 17 registers. 40 years of patience. He looked up. I don't think the timing is incidental. I think something changed recently. On our end. Something it was tracking. He paused. Something that looked, from wherever it was watching, like a conclusion. A conclusion to what? Someone said. I don't know. Deshi's voice was careful. But 40 years ago, what were we doing 40 years ago that we're doing differently? Now? Or stopped doing? Or finally? He searched for the word, finished. Nobody answered because the question was too large for a quick answer and they all knew it. Seba made a note. Not on the tablet. In the small green notebook she kept in her jacket pocket, the one she used for things that weren't ready to be typed yet. She wrote. It waited for something to end. What ended? She underlined it. Then she told the group they had until morning to submit individual hypotheses, closed the session, and went outside to stand in the heat of the cracked basin and think about water and patience, and what it means when something very old decides that now is finally the right moment to speak. The hypotheses came in overnight. Seba read them in order of submission, which was also roughly the order of confidence. The earliest submissions tended to be from people who had slept on the question and arrived at something they believed, the later ones from people who had stayed awake discarding options until only the uncomfortable ones remained. There were 11 hypotheses in total. She laid them out on the table in her office, printed on paper because some things needed to be physical to be properly considered, and she read them the way she had read the names of systems in collapse over 19 years. Methodically, without skipping, giving each one the same count of attention before moving to the next. 7 of the 11 pointed, from different directions, at the same conclusion. The climate. Not as metaphor. Not as political statement. As data. The working group members who had independently arrived at this, a glaciologist from Reykjavik, an atmospheric modeler from Chengdu, the Barents Sea communications lead who turned out, beneath the seasickness, to be an environmental systems analyst, had each framed it differently, but the underlying shape was the same. 40 years ago, the planet's atmospheric carbon concentration had crossed a threshold that all current climate models agreed was the decisive inflection point of the modern era. The moment the trajectory locked in. The moment a set of cascading consequences became, not inevitable exactly, but deeply, structurally probable in a way they had not been before. And then, just in the last 3 years, something had shifted. Not a reversal. Not a solution. But a measurable, consistent, statistically significant change in the rate of change. The planet's systems were still stressed. The Kalahari Basin outside Seba's window was still cracked earth where water used to be. But the acceleration had slowed. The numbers, for the first time in 4 decades, were moving in a different direction. Are you finished yet? Seba sat with that for a long time. Then she called Deshi. He arrived at her office in 12 minutes, which meant he had been awake. He looked at the printed hypotheses spread across the table, read the top 3 without being asked, and sat down in the chair across from her desk with the expression of a man who had been hoping not to be right and was now processing the experience of being right anyway. It was watching the carbon numbers, he said. That's the strongest hypothesis. 7 independent submissions pointing the same direction. It arrives when the trajectory locks in. It waits. He paused, doing the calculation. 40 years, until we change the direction. Then it asks if we're finished. If that interpretation is correct. If. He acknowledged that. But 17 registers, Seba. It asked the same question in 17 different emotional registers. That's not a species that sends simple status checks. That's a species that understands the question might land differently depending on where we are when we receive it. He looked at the hypotheses. It was calibrating for how we might feel about being asked. Seba thought about that. About the engineering behind it, not technological engineering but something more intricate. Emotional architecture. Building a question that could be received as gentle or urgent or formal or intimate depending on what the receiver needed it to be. 17 versions of the same thing so that whoever was listening could find the one that fit. That's a very particular kind of consideration, she said. Yes, Deshi said. It is. They sat with that for a moment. Outside, the early morning was doing the thing it did in the basin. Arriving slowly, light coming in low and long across the cracked ground, turning everything briefly amber before the heat started in earnest. Seba had watched this happen every morning for 4 years and had not yet found it unremarkable. There's a problem with the hypothesis, she said. I know. If it's been watching our environmental data for 40 years, then it knows more about us than we know about it. Deshi nodded. Considerably more. It has 40 years of our atmospheric readings, our deforestation data, our ocean temperature records, our species extinction rates. He paused. Our recovery efforts. It watched us nearly lose something and then watched us start pulling it back. And then it decided to speak. Which means when it asks if we're finished, it's not asking if the crisis is over. It knows the crisis isn't over. He looked at the window. I think it's asking if we're finished ignoring it. If we've crossed some internal threshold. If we've become something different enough from what we were 40 years ago to be worth talking to. Seba picked up her green notebook, opened it to the page where she'd written. It waited for something to end. What ended? She wrote underneath it. Not the crisis. The denial. She looked at that for a long moment. Then she wrote one more line. It waited until we could hear the answer. The decision to respond was not made by a government. It was not made by the Continuance Bureau's Tier 1 escalation protocol, which would have routed the decision upward through 4 administrative layers to a committee that met quarterly. It was not made by consensus of the full working group, which would have required another 48 hours of process and produced a response written by committee, which was to say a response written by nobody. It was made by Seba Vaughn, standing at the signal array console at 0614 hours, with Deshi beside her and the cracked basin outside going amber in the early light. She had the authority to initiate a preliminary response signal under Section 7 of the Bureau's First Contact Provisional Framework, a section that had been written 20 years ago as a theoretical contingency and had never been invoked, but which existed, which meant someone had once believed this moment might come and had thought to leave a door open. She put her hand on the console. One question back, she said. That's all. Not an answer. A question. Deshi looked at her. Which question? She had been thinking about this since 0200. Since she had read the 7th hypothesis and understood what the signal was asking and why it was asking it now. She had turned the response over in her mind the way you turn a stone, looking at every face of it, making sure it was the right shape before you committed to it. What did you see? She said. She pressed the key. The signal went up into the amber morning, thin and precise, aimed at a coordinate 0.3 astronomical units above the ecliptic plane, toward something that had been patient for 40 years and had finally decided the moment had arrived. The basin was very quiet. They waited. The response came in 11 hours and 17 minutes. Not the delay of distance, the signal origin was close enough that lightspeed lag was negligible, a matter of seconds at most. 11 hours was a choice. Something had received their question, considered it for 11 hours, and then answered. Seba found that more significant than anything in the answer itself. 11 hours was not the response time of a system running an automated protocol. It was the response time of something that thought carefully before it spoke. She had not slept. She had tried, briefly, lying on the narrow cot in the station's back room with her green notebook on her chest, and the tablet propped against the wall showing the receiver array status in real time. She had watched the status indicator for approximately 40 minutes before accepting that her body was not going to cooperate and returning to her desk. Deshi had slept for 3 hours in his chair, which she had allowed because Deshi's mind worked better rested and she needed his mind working well. She woke him when the array indicator changed. He was upright and present in the way people are when they have trained themselves to wake quickly. No transition period, no blinking confusion, just an immediate orientation toward whatever required attention. He looked at the display. He looked at Seba. She nodded. They listened together. The response was not sound. It was structured data, encoded in the same mathematical framework as the original signal, the 17-register architecture, the same formal elegance, but inverted now, reconfigured into something that felt less like a question and more like an opening of hands. Deshi worked the decoding in silence for 40 minutes while Seba stood at the window and watched the basin and did not rush him. Because rushing Deshi was like rushing a river. It didn't change the speed, it just added turbulence. When he turned from the display, his face had done the thing it did, held the expression briefly, then reset, but this time the reset was incomplete. Something remained in it. Not distress. Not joy. The particular look of a person who has just understood something that changes the size of the room they thought they were standing in. It answered the question, he said. What did you see? What did it see? He pulled up the decoded transcript on the secondary display and walked her through it section by section, translating as he went, not word for word because the signal didn't work in words but structurally, finding the nearest human concepts for each encoded segment with the careful imprecision of someone who understood that perfect translation was a fantasy and approximate translation was the only honest kind. What the signal described was observation. 40 years of it. Systematic, continuous, detailed in a way that suggested instruments far more sensitive than anything the working group had access to. It had watched the planet's atmospheric chemistry shift in real time. It had watched the ocean temperature gradients change. It had tracked species population data across every continent with a resolution that implied either a surveillance infrastructure of extraordinary sophistication or a period of study so long that even slow biological changes registered as trends rather than noise. It had watched the ice. This was the section Deshi translated most slowly, pausing twice to verify his interpretation against the raw encoding, because the level of detail was, he used the word intimate, then reconsidered, then used it again because no better word existed. It had watched specific glaciers, had tracked their retreat year by year, decade by decade, had noted the rate of acceleration, had noted, in the last 3 years, the first measurable deceleration. It had watched the ice the way you watch something you are not certain will survive. It was worried, Seba said. The word felt strange to apply to an unknown entity 40 years in transit, but it was the accurate word and she had a discipline for accuracy. About the outcome. That's how it reads, Deshi said. The encoding in that section uses a register I haven't seen in the other segments. Something with a weight to it. An emotional frequency I'd translate as, he paused, concerned attention. The kind of attention you give something you cannot intervene in. Something you can only witness. Seba thought about that, about what it meant to have watched for 40 years without intervening. The discipline that required. The particular restraint of a thing with the capability to act choosing instead to observe. It could have contacted us earlier, she said. Yes. It didn't. No. Why not? Deshi looked at the transcript on the display. The last section addresses that. Partially. He scrolled to the final encoded segment. It's the most difficult to translate. The register is one I've only seen twice in the whole transmission. It appears in the original signal too, in one of the 17 question registers. The very gentle one. The one that felt like an invitation rather than a demand. What does it say? He was quiet for a moment. not building to it, just making sure he had it right. It says roughly, approximately, with the caveat that I'm compressing something that takes 40 encoded intervals to express. It says that it has learned, across a long history, that contact made before a species has chosen its direction produces a particular kind of damage. That the act of being seen, before you are ready to be seen, changes what you become. That witness, to be useful, must be patient. He paused. It says it did not want to be the reason we looked up before we had finished looking at each other. The office was very quiet. Outside, the cracked basin held its silence the way it held everything now, with the patient permanence of a thing that had endured a long damage and was only beginning to understand what came next. Seba opened her green notebook. She wrote, "It waited so we could choose ourselves first." She sat with that. Then she wrote the question that had been building since 06:14 the previous morning, since she had pressed the key and sent 2 words into the amber light. The question that the 11-hour response time had made inevitable. The question that everything, the signal, the 40 years, the 17 registers, the ice, had been moving toward. What does it want now? The Tier 2 escalation happened at 0900 hours. The following morning, which meant Seba had approximately 14 hours between understanding what she was dealing with and losing primary control of how it was handled. She had known the escalation was coming. She had filed the trigger report herself because not filing it would have been a different kind of decision, the kind made by omission, which in her experience produced worse outcomes than the kind made directly and left a more complicated residue. She spent the 14 hours preparing. Not preparing a briefing, though she prepared that too. Preparing herself. There was a distinction she had maintained carefully across 19 years of delivering findings that changed the shape of the room, between the part of her that processed information and the part of her that was affected by it, and the discipline of keeping those 2 parts in communication without letting either one dominate. The processing part needed to be sharp and clear for the briefing. The affected part needed somewhere to put what it was carrying so it didn't leak into the room at the wrong moment. She went outside at dusk and stood in the basin for 40 minutes. The heat had dropped to something bearable. The cracked earth under her boots still held the warmth of the day in it. A stored warmth, the ground remembering sun hours after the sun had moved on. She thought about the signal. She thought about 40 years of patient watching. She thought about what it meant to be witnessed by something that had chosen, deliberately, not to intervene. She thought about what the working group didn't yet know. What the final section of Deshi's translation had contained, which she had not shared with the full group yet, because some information needed to be understood by one person completely before it could be managed collectively. This was not a principle she had ever written down. It was a practice she had developed watching committees receive large information badly, diffusing it into debate before anyone had properly sat with it, turning it into position before it had a chance to be truth. The final section of the response had not ended with the statement about witness and patience. There had been one more segment. Brief. A single encoded interval in a register Deshi had not seen anywhere else in the transmission, new, distinct, something he had taken 2 hours to even begin to approach and another 3 to translate with any confidence. He had come to her at 0200 with the translation written in his own notebook, paper, not digital, which told her he understood the weight of it. He had handed her the notebook without speaking. She had read it. She had handed it back. Said, "Are you certain?" He had said, "No. But I'm not uncertain enough to pretend it says something else." She had nodded, told him to sleep, stood at the window for a long time watching the array indicator. What the final segment said, approximately, imprecisely, translated across an incomprehensible cognitive distance by a 34-year-old xenolinguist working alone at 0200 in a monitoring station in a cracked basin that used to be a floodplain, was this: "We are not alone in watching you. Not a threat." Deshi had been emphatic about that. The register was not threatening, did not carry the emotional frequency of warning or menace. It was closer to disclosure. The careful sharing of a fact that the sender understood would be difficult to receive, offered with the same gentleness as the invitation register in the original question. There were others. The signal did not specify how many, or what kind, or for how long. It specified only that the entity transmitting had, at some point in its 40 years of observation, become aware that it was not the only one observing. That others were watching Earth's trajectory with varying degrees of the same concerned attention. that the act of transmitting the original question, the 11-hour response, had been, among other things, an announcement. Not to Earth. To the others. We are speaking to them now. The conversation has begun. Seba had turned that over in her mind all night. The thing it implied. That their response, her 2 words sent into the amber morning, had not only opened a dialogue with one entity. It had, in some broader context she couldn't yet see the edges of, signaled something to an unknown number of other watchers. Changed their status. Made them visible not just to one patient observer but to whatever audience that observer was part of. She had pressed a key. She had not known the room she was broadcasting into. The Tier 2 briefing convened in Pretoria via secure remote connection. 14 people, 9 of them governmental, 3 military liaisons, 1 from the Bureau's own senior oversight structure, and 1 woman named Dr. Amara Osei, who was introduced as an independent consultant and who Seba recognized immediately as the lead architect of the Global Continuance Framework's Contact Risk Modeling Division, which technically did not exist on any public organizational chart. Her presence meant the escalation had gone further, faster, than the 14-hour window suggested. Seba delivered the briefing in 23 minutes. She was thorough. She was precise. She presented the signal data, Deshi's translation methodology, the working group's climate origin. Hypotheses, the 11-hour response, the content of that response up to and including the final segment. She watched the room receive it. The governmental representatives received it the way governmental representatives received large information, by immediately sorting it into categories of threat, opportunity, and jurisdictional ownership. The military liaisons received it more quietly, which she found more unnerving. Dr. Osei received it with complete stillness, her eyes on the briefing display, her hands flat on the table, and Seba had the distinct sense of watching someone run very fast calculations behind a very composed face. When Seba finished, the room was quiet for 7 seconds. She counted. Then the senior governmental representative, a man named Hartley who had the permanent expression of someone managing a headache he considered beneath him, said, "You transmitted without authorization. Under Section 7 of the Provisional Framework," Seba said. "Yes. Section 7 is a theoretical contingency." "It was," she said. "Now it isn't." Hartley looked at her. She held it. She had been holding rooms for 19 years. Dr. Osei said, quietly, without looking up from the display, "She's right that it doesn't matter. The transmission went. The question is what we do with the answer." She looked up, found Seba's eyes across the remote connection. All of the answer, including the part about the others. The room shifted. Seba had expected this moment and had prepared for it, and it was still, she found, harder than preparation made things. Because in the room's shift she could see the future branching, the version where this was handled carefully, and the version where it wasn't, and the distance between those 2 versions was exactly the width of the decisions made in the next 72 hours. She opened her green notebook under the table where the camera couldn't see it. She wrote 1 word, careful. Then she put her pen down and looked back at the room and began the harder work of making that word mean something. The 72 hours did not go carefully. Not catastrophically, nothing broke, nothing leaked to public channels, no government made a unilateral announcement that forced the others into reactive positions. But the careful Seba had written in her notebook and tried to make mean something collided, predictably, with the thing that always happened when large information met large institutions. The institutions began immediately trying to make the information smaller, to fit it into existing frameworks, to find the category it belonged to so they could apply the protocols that category triggered and move toward the comfort of procedure. The problem was that the information did not fit any existing category, and the institution's attempts to force it there were producing exactly the kind of noise that Seba had spent 19 years learning to identify as the precursor to bad decisions. She watched it happen across 4 days of remote briefings, working group expansions, and subcommittee formations that each added more voices and fewer listeners. She watched the clean shape of what they knew get handled by too many hands until it started to lose its edges. She watched Deshi get called into a parallel translation review conducted by 3 other linguists who had not been present for the original signal work and who were, she could tell from his face during the brief moments she saw him, asking him to justify conclusions he had already justified and then justify the justifications. On the 5th day she asked Dr. Osei for a private call. Amara Ose answered from what appeared to be a kitchen somewhere. Not an office, not a secure briefing room. A kitchen with morning light coming through a window behind her and a coffee cup she held with both hands the way people hold things when they are cold or when they need the grounding weight of something physical. She looked, in the context of a kitchen rather than a briefing display, like a person rather than a function. Seba found this reassuring in a way she hadn't expected. "You're going to tell me the process is eating the finding," Ose said. Before Seba had finished formulating the opening. "I'm going to tell you that in 9 days we will have consumed our entire response window debating translation methodology and jurisdictional authority, and we will send nothing back. Or we'll send something designed by committee that tells them we're exactly the kind of species that designs things by committee under pressure, which is also a message, just not the one we choose to send." Ose drank her coffee. "What would you choose to send?" "I don't know yet, but I know it needs to come from a place of—" Seba searched for the right word. Not the institutional word. The honest one. Integrity. It needs to be true. Not diplomatically curated. Not strategically optimized. True. That's a harder brief than it sounds. "I know. Because true means including the parts we're not proud of." Ose set the cup down. The things the 40 years of watching would have seen alongside the ice recovery and the deforestation slowdown. The wars. The famines we manufactured through policy failure. The extinction events we documented and continued. The gap between what we said and what we did for most of those 4 decades. "Yes," Seba said. "You want to send all of it. I want to send enough of it that whatever receives it understands that we understand ourselves. That we're not transmitting a highlight reel. That we know what we are and are choosing to speak anyway." She paused. They watched 40 years of us being complicated. Sending them a simple version now would be a kind of lie. And lying to something that already knows the truth is a particular kind of foolishness. Ose was quiet for a moment. Outside her kitchen window, whatever light was coming through it shifted slightly. A cloud moving, the morning doing what mornings do regardless of what the people beneath them are negotiating. "There's a faction in the oversight structure," she said carefully, "that wants the response to emphasize capability, technological achievement, defense posture." She let that sit for a moment. "The argument is that we don't know what the others are. The ones it mentioned. We don't know their intentions. Projecting strength to something that watched us nearly destroy our own biosphere is projecting the wrong thing," Seba said. "They didn't contact us because we're powerful. They contacted us because something changed. Because we started making a different choice. That's what they're responding to. That's what we need to respond from." Ose looked at her for a long moment. The kitchen light did its thing. The coffee cup sat empty between her hands. "You need Deshi out of the parallel review," she said finally. "Yes. And you need a small team. Not a working group. Not a subcommittee. People who can hold the whole picture without needing to subdivide it." "Yes. I can give you 72 hours. After that, the oversight structure reconvenes and the momentum shifts to the capability emphasis faction." She picked up the coffee cup, looked into it as though checking whether she'd missed any. "Who do you want?" Seba had been thinking about this for 4 days. Since the first briefing, since the room had shifted and she had written careful in her notebook and watched the carefulness start to erode. She had been making a list in her mind, not of credentials or clearances, but of something harder to name. People who could be in the presence of something enormous and remain themselves, who wouldn't shrink it or inflate it, who would let it be the size it actually was. "Deshi," she said. "Priya Fun. The atmospheric modeler from Chengdu. Her name is Lin Bao. And the communications analyst from the Barents Sea." "The seasick one?" "He wasn't seasick because he was weak. He was seasick because he cared enough to be on a vessel in the Barents Sea at 0400 waiting for something like this. That's the kind of person I need." Ose almost smiled. It didn't quite complete itself, but it was visible as an intention. 72 hours, she said. "Don't waste them being careful." "I thought careful was what we were going for." "Careful about the truth," Ose said. "Not careful about saying it." She closed the connection. Seba sat for a moment in the quiet of her office. Then she opened her green notebook and began making a different kind of list. Not names, not protocols, not frameworks. She wrote at the top of the page, "What is true about us that we would want a witness to see?" She sat with the question for a long time. Then she began, slowly, to write. They worked in the station's back room, which was the largest space available and still barely adequate for 4 people, a signal array console, 3 laptops, and the accumulated intensity of people trying to compress something true about humanity into a transmission that would travel 0.3 astronomical units and be received by something that had spent 40 years watching them fail and recover and fail again. Seba had pushed the cot against the wall and dragged in a folding table. Lin Bao had arrived from Chengdu with a hard drive containing 40 years of atmospheric data and a comm that Seba recognized as the specific comm of someone who had spent years watching large systems behave badly and had made peace with the limits of her influence over them. The communications analyst from the Barents Sea. His name was Tomas Reyes, and he had driven 17 hours from a port in northern Norway to be here because there were no available flights that connected to anywhere near the Kalahari Basin in under 30 hours. Arrived with a duffel bag, a technical manual for the signal encoding array, and the look of a man who had used the 17-hour drive to think and had arrived already thinking. Deshi came in last, released from the parallel review 40 minutes before the session started, and sat down at the table with the particular quiet of a person who has been asked the same question many times by people who didn't listen to the answer and is now in a room where they might. 72 hours, Seba said. We're not building a diplomatic document. We're not making a strategic argument. We're answering what they asked us, what they've been asking since the first signal. Whether we're finished. What we've become. We have to answer that honestly or we're wasting the transmission. She looked around the table. What do we send? The first 6 hours were the hardest. Not because of disagreement, the 4 of them agreed more than Seba had expected, which was itself a kind of data point about what happened when you put the right people in a room. The difficulty was the opposite of disagreement. It was the difficulty of abundance. Every direction they turned, there was material. Every attempt to identify what was most essentially true about humanity at this particular moment opened into something vast and internally contradictory and stubbornly resistant to summary. Lin Bao made the first useful cut. She spread her atmospheric data across the table, printed, physical, the same instinct Seba had about large information needing to be held, and traced the 40-year arc with her finger. The inflection point, the long terrible middle, the recent deceleration. They watched this, she said. This is the story they know. Whatever we send needs to be in conversation with this story, not separate from it. So we start with the damage, Tomas said. Not a question, a structural proposal. We start with the knowledge of the damage, Deshi said. There's a difference. The damage they saw. What they may not have been able to see is whether we knew. Whether we understood what we were doing while we were doing it. Seba wrote that down. The gap between knowing and stopping. That's the most human thing, Priya said from the corner where she had been sitting quietly with her own notebook, listening more than speaking, which was her rhythm. Every person who ever lived has experienced that gap. Knowing something was wrong and continuing anyway. The distance between comprehension and change. She looked at the table. That gap is where most of our history lives. And the closing of it, Lin Bao said quietly. The times we closed it, that's also where our history lives. They worked through the night that way, not building an argument but finding the true shape of something. The contours of a species that had spent 300,000 years oscillating between its worst comprehension and its best impulses, rarely achieving the best consistently, never fully surrendering to the worst, persisting in the complicated middle ground with a stubbornness that looked, from the outside, like either stupidity or faith, and from the inside felt like both simultaneously. At 0300 hours, Tomas solved the encoding problem. The transmission architecture, how to carry something this complex in the mathematical framework the signal used, had been the practical constraint underlying everything else. The 17-register system they'd received was sophisticated, but it was built for questions, for inquiry. Answering in the same framework felt like trying to describe a landscape using only the grammar of cartography. Technically possible. Fundamentally reductive. Tomas had been quiet for 4 hours, working at the encoding console while the others talked, building and discarding structural approaches with the methodical focus of a man who trusted the process even when the process wasn't producing results yet. At 0300, he turned from the console and said, "We don't answer in their framework." Everyone looked at him. "We send our own. A new one. We show them how we encode, not just what we're encoding." He pulled up the display. "We received something in 17 registers. We send something in." He checked his work. 31. Every register a different human mode of understanding. Logic, narrative, music, mathematics, grief, humor. He looked up, slightly uncertain. "I know humor sounds wrong, but..." "It doesn't," Deshi said immediately. "Humor is a cognitive technology. It's how we process things that are too large for direct confrontation. Sending it tells them something fundamental about how we survive ourselves." Seba stood and walked to the console display, looked at the architecture Tomas had built. It was elegant in the way that things are elegant when someone has thought about them long enough to reach the far side of complexity and found the simple structure waiting there. "This is good," she said. "It's a start," Tomas said. "We still have to fill it." They filled it in the remaining 40 hours the way you fill something that matters. Not quickly, not by consensus, but by each person bringing what they actually knew and trusting that the combination would be truer than any individual contribution. Lin Bao built the environmental record section, 40 years of data compressed into a register that showed not just the numbers but the decisions behind the numbers. Priya constructed the scientific framework, not achievements but methodology, the human practice of testing beliefs against reality and revising when reality disagreed. Tomas encoded the communication architecture itself as a kind of self-referential honesty. Here is how we built this transmission, here is what we couldn't figure out, here is the argument we had about humor at 0300. Deshi worked on what he called the difficult register, the one that would carry the gap Lin Bao had named between knowing and stopping, the long record of comprehending harm and continuing to cause it. He worked on it alone, slowly, and when he brought it to the group at hour 38 his face had done its expression then reset, except this time what remained after the reset was something quieter and more settled than Seba had seen from him before, like a man who had looked at something painful directly and found that the looking, though hard, had not destroyed him. "It's honest," he said simply. "It doesn't excuse anything. It shows the gap and it shows the closing. Both." Seba read it. It was honest. It was the most difficult kind of honest, the kind that doesn't soften the thing by immediately following it with redemption, but lets the failure sit in full view long enough to be real before showing what came after. She looked at her team around the table. For people who had driven and flown and sat through 17 hours of Norwegian coastline and arrived ready to do this work. She thought about the 40 years the signal had waited. The patience of that. The faith it implied that waiting was worth it. That something would change. She thought about what she had written in her notebook 6 days ago. What is true about us that we would want a witness to see? She had her answer now. Not a clean answer. Not a comfortable one. Everything, she thought. We send everything. The damage and the knowledge of it. The gap and the closing. The humor at 0300 and the grief underneath the humor. The child learning to tend a dying ecosystem with the same stubborn love their ancestors applied to fire. All of it unedited. Addressed to something patient enough to have waited for exactly this. At 0558 hours, 2 minutes before the 72-hour window closed, Seba looked at her team and said, "Is it true?" One by one they said yes. She pressed the key. The response came 3 days later. Not 11 hours this time. 3 days. Seba had expected a longer wait. Had told herself to expect weeks, possibly months, possibly silence, because the transmission they had sent was considerable and whatever received it deserved time to sit with something considerable before answering. 3 days felt fast. 3 days felt like something that had been waiting a long time and had found, finally, what it was waiting for. She received the signal alert at 0442 hours. Still dark outside. The basin holding the last cool of night before the heat began its patient daily return. She was already awake. She had been sleeping badly since the transmission, not from anxiety exactly, but from the particular restlessness of a person who has done the thing they set out to do and now exists in the space after completion, where the next thing has not yet revealed its shape. She had been filling that space by going outside at night and standing in the basin and looking up, which was not something she had done before this month and which she suspected she would continue doing after it because the sky looked different now. Not changed, just noticed. The way a room looks different once you understand someone else has been standing in it. She called Deshi first, then the others. By 05:10 the back room was full again, the same 4 people around the same folding table, coffee from the station's machine that was bad in the familiar way that made it feel like continuity, the display showing the incoming signal data in real time as the array processed the transmission. It was longer than anything they had received before. Deshi worked for 6 hours. Seba did not rush him. The others moved in and out of the room. Priya made calculations on her laptop in the corner. Lin Bao went outside twice and came back quieter both times. Tomas sat at the encoding console and read the raw signal structure with the focused patience of a man who understood that some things revealed themselves only to sustained attention. At 1,134 hours, Deshi turned from the display. His face held its expression for longer than usual, longer than Seba had ever seen it hold. When the reset came, it was incomplete again, as it had been after the first response, but this time what remained was not the complex, unnameable thing from before. What remained was simpler, clearer. The face of a man who had understood something and found that understanding it had changed the weight of the room in a way he would need time to fully measure. "It's not one voice," he said. Seba looked at him. "The transmission. It's not coming from a single sender." He turned back to the display, pointed to the structural analysis running alongside the decoded content. "The framework is unified, same encoding architecture, but the registers inside it are distinct. Individually distinct. I can count at least," he checked, 9 separate cognitive signatures. 9 different, I want to say 9 different minds, but that's my framework, not necessarily theirs. He paused. "Whatever they are, they deliberated. This response was constructed collectively. 9 of them sat with what we sent and produced this together." "The others," Tomas said quietly. Deshi nodded. "I think the first signal was one entity, 40 years, patient observation, a single question. And when we answered, when we sent the 31 registers, something changed. The audience expanded. We sent our transmission into a room we couldn't see, and this," he gestured at the display, "this is the room writing back." The silence in the back room was different from the silences that had come before it. Those silences had been full of question. This one was full of something that hadn't finished becoming what it was yet. The content of the response took Deshi the rest of the day to translate fully, working through it section by section with the rest of them gathered around or nearby, close enough to hear, close enough to ask questions, far enough to let him work. What it contained was not what any of them had expected, though afterward Seba would find it difficult to articulate exactly what she had expected, because the expectation had been shapeless, some amalgam of diplomatic formality, alien incomprehensibility, and the particular disappointment of reality failing to match the size of the moment. The response matched the size of the moment. It was the first communication from multiple non-human intelligences to humanity, received in a cracked basin in southern Africa at a folding table with bad coffee, and it was an introduction. 9 voices, 9 histories, 9 different registers of presence. Not a unified council speaking in one voice. Not a hierarchy presenting credentials. 9 distinct entities, each one contributing something of themselves in a different register, structured by Tomas's own 31 framework turned back toward them like a mirror, because they had learned the framework from the transmission, had understood it well enough in 3 days to use it, which was either a sign of extraordinary intelligence or a sign that the framework Tomas had built was more universally intuitive than any of them had imagined. Probably both. One spoke in what Deshi translated as deep time, a register that conveyed perspective across geological scales, a mode of understanding in which 40 years was genuinely brief, in which the history of a species was a single intake of breath. Not condescending, just large. The largeness of something very old trying to show you the size of its experience without crushing you with it. One spoke in what could only be called curiosity. Pure, structurally uncomplicated curiosity. The register of something that found other minds genuinely interesting and made no attempt to conceal that interest. Deshi said this one was his favorite. Nobody argued. One spoke in loss. A register heavy with the specific grief of a species that had watched others not make it. That had been the patient witness at endings and carried those endings with it. Not warning, the register was not warning. Witness. The particular tenderness of something that knew what failure looked like and was relieved. Deshi said, genuinely relieved, to be having this conversation. The others, 6 more, each distinct, each bringing something different from their own history and cognition, spoke in registers that Deshi translated with increasing confidence as the hours passed, building fluency the way you build fluency in any language, through immersion and accumulated context and the slow calibration of your instincts against the evidence. At 1900 hours, Seba read the final section of the translation alone, sitting outside in the cooling basin with the last amber light going bronze around her and her green notebook open on her knee. The final section was addressed specifically to the sender of the original 2-word response. Not to humanity collectively, to whoever had asked, "What did you see?" It said, approximately, imprecisely, translated across a distance no instrument fully measured, that the question had been the right question. That most species, receiving the original signal, asked about the sender. Who are you? Where are you from? What do you want? Do you come in peace? The reflexive grammar of a species that orients everything toward itself. Asking what the witness had seen was different. It was the question of a species capable of genuine curiosity about a perspective other than its own. Capable of understanding that being observed was itself information. That a 40-year witness might have seen something worth knowing. It said that the 31 registers had been studied carefully. That the difficult register, Deshi's honest register, the gap between knowing and stopping, had been the most significant. Not because it was the darkest, but because of what it demonstrated. That a species willing to show its failures to an unknown audience, without softening them, without immediately following them with redemption. That was a species that understood the difference between truth and performance. That understood what honesty cost and paid it anyway. Said, "We have been watching a long time. We have waited through many windows. You are the 14th species we have spoken to. And then, you are the first to ask what we saw." Seba sat with that for a long time. The basin cooled around her. The sky above it did what it had been doing for 4 billion years before this moment. Darkened slowly, deliberately, stars emerging one by one from the blue, the ordinary patient astronomy of a planet that had been here long enough to know that most nights were followed by mornings. She opened her notebook to a fresh page. At the top she wrote the date. Below it she wrote the question she had asked 6 days ago. What is true about us that we would want a witness to see? She looked at it for a while. Then she wrote underneath, apparently, the part that still asks. She looked at that. It wasn't a complete answer. It wasn't the kind of answer you put in a report or present to a committee or use to close a section of analysis. It was the kind of answer that opens things rather than closing them. That points toward rather than arriving at. The kind of answer that is really the beginning of a longer question you will spend the rest of your life asking. She closed the notebook. Above her the stars were very old and very many, and had been here long before anyone had thought to look at them, and would be here long after the looking. She looked at them anyway. She thought it was probably the right response. Inside, through the window, she could see Deshi still at the display, still working, still translating, still finding the words for things that had never had words before. She watched him for a moment, the light from the display on his face, the stillness of a person entirely absorbed in the most important work of their life. She picked up her notebook, stood, brushed the cracked earth from her boots, went back inside to help,